nobody sees the chat.
Okay, that's reassuring. Anyway, if no one can see it, no one can use it, and therefore we don't have to worry about it.
All better. Okay. Bienvenue au séminaire en informatique. Vous avez déjà reçu les résumés, et je n'ai pas l'intention de chipper le temps de M. POTTS pour vous dire ça en français. Il est là pour parler de la relation entre l'approche symbolique et l'approche dite connectionniste au langage et au traitement de l'information. Welcome to the seminar in cognitive informatics, where we have Christopher Potts from Stanford here, who's your formation is in linguistics or in computer science or both?
Yeah, primarily linguistics.
So who's a linguist, and he's talking about something that has been up in the air for quite a while, about the relation between symbolic approaches, what used to be called GoFi, symbolic AI, and also in logic and linguistics, logic and philosophy, what is meant by symbolic models and symbolic approaches, and that large family of models that now includes deep learning, large language models, just neural networks. It's very broad and very rapidly changing terrain. And so Chris is taking a chance in staking himself on some solid ground because it may not be there in a short time. So the challenge is to relate these two, what shall I say, the two parts of the pie. Chris Potts, welcome to Montreal.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here with you all. Yes, meaning in large language models. That is my project for today. I thought I would start on a personal note. I'm a linguist, as Steven said. I got my dissertation in 2003, and shortly after that, I published a revised version of that dissertation, 2005, 20 years ago. That was The Logic of Conventional Implicatures. And a funny thing about this book is that it has a very extended discussion of swears. I was and continue to be very interested in swears. Now, the book is full of very formal analyses like this one. We don't need to worry about the details of this analysis here. The reason I'm showing it is in part that it is very formal, which is going to be a theme of the talk today. I do think there is an insight behind this, which is that the swear contributes a secondary meaning that is separate from the main content as kind of emotive side commentary. But even after doing all this work on swears, I felt like I still didn't have a satisfying answer to the question that originally motivated me. Why do people swear? What do speakers intend with their swears? What impact does it have on the people who encounter them? And why do we care so much as a society about swears? And I found that the toolkit of formal semantics and pragmatics, the stuff I used in my book, was just not sufficient for answering those big and important questions. And that kind of sent me off into the world of corpus linguistics so that I could look at lots of real instances of people swearing. And that kind of sent me off into NLP. And that happened at a moment in which NLP was starting to develop tools that were going to allow me, I could tell, to do everything I did in my book, but also embrace, this question here, this really meaty, broader question. And I guess from there was kind of no going back. And that personal journey is kind of relevant today because what I'm going to do is try to chart out the historical influences of semantics and pragmatics, and then use that as a chance to imagine an alternative future for those fields, maybe a future that we make real, in which we embrace much more of questions like why people swear and have a toolkit that will let us do that. So my talk has 3 parts. I'm going to start by tracing some historical influences, and then we'll do semantics and connectionist semantics. And I'm very happy for your feedback, so I'll pause at the end of each one of these parts. And if you have questions, we can start some discussion. But let me launch in here. I'm going to trace these historical influences. I'm not myself a historian. I'm very happy for feedback on this picture. I do think I have the semantics and pragmatics part right, though, which is the really crucial piece. So on this slide, I have a timeline at the bottom. It starts in the kind of early modernist era in the 1920s and spans 100 years. And the root of everything that I'm going to talk about today, essentially, is logical positivism. This is an early modernist movement that is heavily oriented toward formalization. You could have in mind here people like Bertrand Russell, the early Wittgenstein, Rudolf Carnap, people like that. Positivism has many dimensions, but the one that's really crucial for us today is a kind of interest in that group to reduce everything to logic. And I think the animating force behind that was a vision of formalizing everything about science so that we would have an axiom system that we could churn through and really derive new scientific results at a faster rate than ever before. This is an idea that fell out of fashion for roughly 100 years, but might be resurgent in the era of Gen AI. Soon after that, we get a kind of tempering of that positivist perspective, especially in this set of results that I've called the limits of math and computation. You could have in mind there things like Gödel's incompleteness theorems and Turing's result about the halting problem, various incompleteness results, and so forth. And those temper some of the enthusiasm around axiomatization that we get from the positivists. And soon after that, we get the lambda calculus, which is a kind of embodiment of the theory of computation as Turing defined it. At about the same time as the lambda calculus, we get a rise in distributional linguistics. And in the US, this was really led by Zelig Harris, who was Chomsky's teacher. And soon after that, we get the rise of Chomsky in linguistics. There is a bit of a break between Harris and Chomsky, but in fact, many of the methods behind Chomsky's program, which continue on into the present era, are heavily distributional. So there's a strong influential link there. Chomsky's approach gave rise to a first major approach to semantics, generative semantics, which is a highly representational theory of meaning. And I do want to say also that this Chomskyan thing in particular is a through line all the way to the present. The kind of tenets of Chomsky's theory as laid down in the 50s, they continue with us today. We now have all the ingredients, I would say, for Montague semantics, which is going to be a star of my talk. Richard Montague was a philosopher, a student of Tarski's, and so he was heavily kind of grounded in this region of the map here. And Montague defined a view of semantics that you could characterize as being centered around discrete interpreted representations. That'll be kind of the beating heart of semantic theory, and that again is a through line that continues from Montague to the present day. At about the same time, we get Gricean pragmatics. We have almost all the ingredients already for Grice. The one new piece is the ordinary language philosophers. Grice emerges as a kind of mediator between the ordinary language philosophers and the positivists. And what Grice did is create a through line all the way to the present that is essentially a theory of pragmatics, of language use, that is about reasoning about discrete representations. And so this relationship here is very important. This is a kind of semantics pragmatics boundary. We got the representations here, and reasoning about them is the job of pragmatics. The Turing test is in there, 1950. I did not forget it. It will actually be an important piece in the story today, but it is critical that it is not really an influential piece for Montague or for Grice or for Chomsky. We get Shannon's mathematical theory of computation in 1948. I'm using that as a kind of stand-in for the rise of statistical learning theory, which gives birth to lots of things like modern NLP and AI. We also get in parallel movement around decision theory, especially in economics, and that gives rise to Lewis's signaling systems, which is an interesting alternative perspective to thinking about both semantics and pragmatics. All the things that I have on the slide so far are kind of influences on modern pragmatics, probabilistic pragmatics. I'll say a brief note about that later, but I would say the important thing is, even in its modern form, probabilistic pragmatics is essentially a theory of reasoning about discrete interpreted representations. Shannon's theory up here gives rise to lots of different things. In particular, it's kind of a starting point for modern artificial intelligence. I've got that symboled by the famous Dartmouth workshop, which was led by John McCarthy. Shannon was one of the attendees. That was the workshop where they planned over the course of a few months to solve all the major problems of AI. It was an incredible group, but spoiler alert, they didn't get as far as they hoped to. But nonetheless, very influential, especially in what we might call good old-fashioned AI. That gives rise to Winograd's Sherdlu system, which I'm using here as a kind of stand-in for approaches in NLP and AI to semantics. And that's a view of semantics that is heavily influenced, especially by generative semantics and in turn by Chomsky, but also by this overall vision of artificial intelligence. Connectionism, of course, is in there, and that's going to be a major player in my talk today. And now we have all the ingredients for what you might call modern Bayesian cognitive science, starting in the late 90s and early 2000s. We also get statistical natural language processing. That's kind of directly influenced by Shannon and marks a break between the past of NLP as represented by the Sherdlu system and the present that we now live in. And that creates a through line all the way to deep learning and modern generative AI, which will also be important for the talk today. So that is the landscape there. I've probably left some things out. I'm very happy to talk about what else we should insert as influences. But now I'm going to zoom in on semantics. And here I think I have exactly the right set of influences. So the major player here will be Montague. And I've got the immediate influences on Montague in red and the indirect ones there in blue with dotted lines. So first, as I said before, Montague is heavily influenced by the positivists. His teacher was Tarski. He seems to have been philosophically grounded in that era. And what you see in Montague semantics is a kind of desire to have semantic theories be axiom systems. And you see a lot of the exuberance around the idea that the axiom system will be the theory of a natural language like English. It is kind of striking. Montague was also heavily steeped in these limitative results for math and computation. As I said, his teacher was Tarski. But you don't get any of that kind of concern coming through in Montague semantics. In Montague semantics, I feel like there's just endless optimism around the idea that an axiom system could deliver everything we want as a theory of some empirical phenomenon. So Montague was kind of a positivist. We see that very strongly. He was also influenced by the rise of the lambda calculus. That's an important influence. And the third major one is Chomsky. Montague unfortunately passed away quite young. I'm not sure he would be happy to hear me say that he was heavily influenced by Chomsky, but you can see that he was in the character of his theories. And we now know, I think, from work that Ivano Capronegro at UCSC has done,